And I think a good starting point is to look at the sort of journey and the end of the road now for former Eskom CEO Brian Molefe. It was found that he must pay back 10 million rand of a 30 million rand pension he received from cash-strapped power utility Eskom when he resigned. Molefe had approached the Constitutional Court for relief, but the Apex Court declined to hear the matter, saying there was no reasonable prospects of success. Last year, the North Gauteng High Court ruled that Molefe had enriched himself unlawfully from Eskom's pension funds. Deborah Tumbo, an attorney and corporate governance expert, as well as the chairperson of Tumbo Scott Incorporated, joins us to discuss this matter further. So good to have you in studio. Welcome.
Morning, and thank you for having me, Leah.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. So, two cases of Eskom's money we've seen coming through, recovered by courts within 6 weeks. In June, it was trillion,
yes,
ordered to pay 600 million. Now we saw yesterday, Brian Molefe, 11 million.
Yes.
Given the context of these stories and the violations that we're seeing, how deep is it at Eskom, do you think?
So I think what we see now is that during the tenure of particular board members at Eskom, a lot of decisions that should not have been made were made, and it's resulted in individuals that weren't entitled to certain monies being paid to them, enriching themselves at the expense of the power utility. That is something that should rest squarely on the board, because the board of directors is essentially the oversight body that should ensure that things are happening as they should throughout the organization. And it's quite clear that in many respects they failed in that duty.
You know, one of the things that we're seeing is the fact that the DA, I think it was the EFF, it was Solidarity, they took this to the courts. And
Yes.
then, of course, you know, this is a question we need to ask. Are the courts the last hope of actually getting disputes resolved and restoring credibility?
I do think the courts are the last hope, but there are various steps that organizations can take prior to going to the courts. Obviously, in the case of Brian Molefe and as well as Trillion, even if Eskom had taken the matter itself, and as a matter of fact, I think in the Trillion matter, Eskom took the matter up in the court itself, that those kinds of claims back for money would have always been resisted, and it always would have ended up in court. So I think we need to look at what measures is Eskom putting in place going forward to even prevent a situation where they would have to approach the courts, or where other people have to approach the courts on their behalf and on the behalf of the South African taxpayer in order to claw back some of these mistakes that have been made at board level.
I mean, it's quite an interesting issue to discuss, because there have been so many different successful cases, and we look at civil society groups because they've played a major role in all of this. I mean, just to name a few: Corruption Watch, Freedom Under Law, CASEC. You know, I suppose the question has to be asked that if they didn't go to courts in the first place, had the country's law enforcement agencies done anything about it?
So one thing that's very obvious right now is that our law enforcement agencies, our criminal justice system, or even to a certain extent our justice system as a whole, has not been working as it should. And civil society has played a pivotal role in ensuring that society is not hard done by nefarious individuals in high places. However, they have done their job, and civil society has been very effective. However, government, our criminal justice system, our justice system also has a role to play. And it comes back to the question of governance and leadership. What measures are we putting in place to ensure that these mistakes don't even happen? Because prevention is better than cure. And when you talk prevention, you're talking about governance structures, putting proper governance structures and processes in place, because that is the foundation of ensuring that the right decisions are made when the time comes to make those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched on two important issues. It's governance and leadership. Good governance, good leadership. And unfortunately, it appeared at a time that we had lost that, and especially when we look at a lot of the state-run institutions. I mean, just again, getting back to two issues: 600 million rand having to be paid back by Trillion, 11 by Brian Molefe. But this is nothing, you know, in comparison to, I suppose, the greater amount. Are we clawing back, though? I mean, can you see signs that perhaps lessons are now being set, precedents are being set, where people are saying, okay, well, we're not going to get away with this anymore?
So consequences, and seeing people suffer consequences, and seeing these kinds of cases go through the courts and successfully so, is definitely a deterring factor. People will now start thinking twice before they do things, because it won't be so easy to think that one will get away with it. Consequence management is entirely important, but I want to keep going back to the issue of governance and leadership, because that is the foundation of ensuring that, for instance, the Companies Act, which applies to SOEs, although they have their own acts that operationalize them, has many measures in place to ensure that the board and people that have a direct interest in the company can vindicate the rights of the company themselves. Section 76 of the Companies Act is very clear about standards of conduct of the board. Section 77 very clear about liability for boards of directors. However, we're not seeing enough of those cases coming through the courts, and perhaps we should, because we have the laws, we have the Companies Act in the corporate space, we have the PFMA in the government space, but we also have an uncodified piece or document called the King Code on Good Governance, and it aims to set out a number of principles of good governance across the board, not just for corporate entities, but it has various sector supplements in the NGO space, in the governance space, in the small business space, and that's a document we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, we don't, and we also, I suppose, don't also look at the other government instruments that are already in place. I mean, if you look at something like the PMFA and other measures, they're there, and the idea is to respect the law and for accountability. However, it seems that they get ignored, and the reality is that nobody actually ever goes to prison for these violations, and maybe the paying back the money is not a harsher sentence as perhaps going and spending time behind bars.
Yes, I mean, we've seen stories throughout society, be it in the private sector or in the public sector, of malfeasance at board level. We're talking fraud and corruption. If you think about, things of Steinhoff and VBS Bank, just to name a few. Yeah. You've seen these clear violations of the law, not only flouting of governance principles, good governance principles, but clear violations of the law. Who should be taking those fights up, and how do we ensure that consequences are managed in such a way that people understand the full extent of the law should they break the law in the same way that we've seen in the past years?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad you touched on Steinhoff and other issues, because we can't live in a dream world thinking that this is only happening at state-owned enterprises. I mean, this is major, and it's happening all over corporate South Africa as well, and possibly in an even bigger way.
Yes, I mean, there's a governance crisis throughout South Africa. I mentioned that we don't pay enough attention to a document such as the King Codes. There's a leadership crisis throughout the continent, and that finds itself expressed in many ways. It's a failure of leadership of organizations. It's a failure of leadership of people, but also a failure of leadership of self, which is perhaps one of the most difficult forms of leadership to master, because one must be able to lead themselves in order to lead other people and stand on a set number of principles and values that inform the decisions that one makes. And that's why we see it throughout, and even in the private sector. And that's why I always say that governance and good governance is like the foundations when you're building a house. Steinhoff built itself very high. It went very far. However, its foundations were not sturdy enough. So that's why we've seen it coming down as we have, because what governance loopholes were they that allowed Marcus Jooste or whoever was implicated in, the impropriety that we saw there? What allowed them to continue for so long? Yeah,
I mean, when you work in this sector in corporate governance all the time, and I think a lot of people, look in and think, how far gone are we as a country when it comes to this? Because people are worried. They're genuinely worried about things that are affecting them, because this is affecting pension funds. It affects lights going on. It affects our currency. It affects our everyday lives, jobs that are being lost everywhere you look. And, at the end of the day, one has to look at corporate governance, and that plays a major part in all of this.
It does, and it's not difficult and it's not unfair for people to feel despondent and hopeless, but I do think that there is hope. For instance, if you look at something like the Global Competitive Index or the Global Competitive Report, which the World Bank publishes on an annual basis, you see that South Africa has the laws in place. In terms of conflict of interest, we are amongst one of the top 20 countries in the world. However, if you look at corruption, fraud, and organized crime, we're one of the worst in the world, you know, in the bottom 50 countries. And why is that? It's a question of enforcement. It's a question of putting these things to operation. We have a sophisticated legal framework in the governance space, but now we need to see it coming alive. And that's why we do the work that we do, in order to ensure that everybody, small businesses, listed entities alike, understand the role that they have to play in building a long-lasting and sustainable economy.
It's been a pleasure chatting to you. Thanks so much for coming in. Deborah Tumbo is an attorney and corporate governance expert. She's also the chairperson of Tumbo Scott Incorporated, discussing whether some of the state institutions are failing to commit to governance practices as well as exercising financial prudence when it comes to public funds. Thanks very, very much again.
Thank you.
All right, let's take a break. When we return, we'll bring you the daily newspapers and tell you what they're leading with this morning. Stay tuned.